Right. So this is Dr. Abdullah Kamal, and this is my first YouTube channel. It's called Just Pass It. So the main purpose of this channel is to help you pass USMLE Step 1. But actually, the content that I'm gonna share with you here, you can use it in Step 2 CK, in Step 3, or even like you need this information to be a good doctor. So let's get started. So here, um, here is our first topic we're gonna discuss, which is the relation between insulin, glucose, and ketones. So before we get started, and actually we're gonna discuss few disorders here. So before we get to this, let's first introduce the topic to you. So here, rule number one, if you have insulin, this means you have no ketones. So why is that? So to explain this equation, you need to know first, ketones are plan B. Glucose is plan A. So what does it mean? Glucose is a plan A for the body. So glucose is a primary source of energy for the body, and this is like the preferred plan or the preferred source of energy. But sometimes you don't have glucose, right? So you need to have plan P, which is ketone bodies. So if you don't have glucose, this means you can depend on ketone bodies. So why, if there's insulin, this means no ketones. Okay, so what stimulate insulin release? Glucose, right? So glucose stimulate insulin release. So if you have insulin, this means you have glucose as well, right? So if you have glucose, you don't need ketones again. So why? If you have insulin, there are no ketones. So if you have insulin, this means you have glucose because the glucose is the main stimulator or inducer to insulin release. So if you have insulin, you mean you have glucose. This means you don't need any ketones, okay? So this is rule number one. Rule number two is like, where do you get those ketones? So ketones comes from fatty acid, and fatty acid comes from triglyceride, right? Or TAG, whatever. So free fatty acid converts to ketones. And in order to that, you need two enzymes. First, carnitine. Second, medium chain fatty acid degradation. So the rule of each of those, fatty acid degradation to ketones always happen inside the mitochondria. To carnitine helps fatty acid gets into the mitochondria and able to be degraded or converted to ketones. And the enzymes which converts fatty acid to ketones is called medium chain fatty acid. So in order to convert fatty acid to ketones, you need two enzymes, first carnitine and second medium chain fatty acid. So next, here we have four cases. The first case, it mentions you have low glucose and you have high ketones. Oh, okay. High glucose, high ketones. This is very normal, right? You don't have plan A, so you get to plan B. Okay, and when do you don't have glucose? This is in starvation, right? Starvation. Or keto diet, right? And that's actually the whole point of keto diet. How? So in keto diet, you don't have a lot of glucose, right? Your diet is primarily depends on fat and protein, and you kind of like try to decrease carbohydrates and glucose. So you don't have glucose, and this means you have low insulin level. And if you have low insulin level, this means we have high ketones level. And high ketones, where does the ketones come from? It comes from fatty acids. And where does the fatty acids come from? It comes from triglyceride. So you break triglyceride, which is the fat. So that's how the keto diet breaks fat. Okay, so that's normal. Next, you have high glucose and high ketones. High glucose, high ketones. Oh my God, that's doesn't make sense because it told us if you have glucose, this means you have insulin, and if you have insulin, you don't have ketones. So what happened here? So actually, the link between glucose and ketones is insulin. So if you have this link disappear, then you have high glucose and high ketones. So what is this disease? It's diabetic ketoacidosis, right? So in diabetic ketoacidosis, you don't have any insulin. And if you don't have insulin, the glucose won't decrease, right? So you have high glucose, but you don't have insulin. So if you don't have insulin, you're gonna have a high ketones. Again, in DKA, you have high glucose, but you don't have the link um, between the, glucose and ketones. So you here have plan A and plan B, right? Okay. Third case, you have low glucose, you have low ketones, and you have hyperlipidemia, and sometimes hyperlipidemia and hyperuricemia. And actually, this is von Gerb disease, okay? Von Gerb disease. So what happens here is so where does you get where do you get your glucose? What are the sources of glucose? Yeah, you can get the glucose externally from diet or from food, but you also can get glucose internally. And in order to get glucose internally, there's only two pathways. The first, we call it gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis means you produce glucose from scratch. Or glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis means you have stored glycogen, you convert those stored glycogen into glucose, right? So either way, either the body choose gluconeogenesis or glycogenolysis, both of them ends with something called glucose 6-phosphate. And glucose 6-phosphate kind of like trapped. So the phosphate here traps the glucose inside the cell. In order for this glucose to be released into the circulation, you need to remove this phosphate. And the enzyme that remove this phosphate is called glucose 6 phosphatase, which means it removes phosphate. So it converts to glucose, right? So in von Wieren's disease, you have deficiency in glucose 6 phosphatase, so you don't get to this interaction. So you have a lot of glucose inside the cell, but the systemic glucose is kind of like low. So you have, right, low glucose. And if you have low glucose and you don't have plan A, so the body gonna go for plan B, right? So this is von Wieren's disease and is very, very characteristic because usually it gives you hyperlipidemia, and usually this is kind of like a kid, it's kind of like metabolic disorder. So keep that in mind. The last case is you have low glucose and low ketones, and that doesn't make sense because if you have low glucose, this means you have low insulin level. And if you have low insulin level, you're supposed to have high ketones level, right? Because you don't have plan A, so you gotta have plan B, right? So what's the defect here? The defect here is I told you like fatty acid converts to ketones. And in order to do though, you need two things, carnitine, which which moves fatty acid into the mitochondria. So another enzyme called medium chain fatty acid dehydrogenase, which um, uh, degrade or break down the fatty acid to ketones. Again, the process includes carnitine, take the fatty acid and put it in the mitochondria, and in mitochondria there is another enzyme called medium chain fatty acid dehydrogenase, which convert fatty acid to ketones. So, if you have carnitine deficiency or you have medium chain fatty acid dehydrogenase deficiency, you won't be able to convert fatty acid into ketones. Okay, so just it does make sense. All of it does make sense. I know it's confusing, but that's everything you need to know. Thank you. If you like my content, please subscribe and hit the like button. And I'm gonna post, I'll try to post like daily USMLE video. Thank you.